come on and play at Alpha Draft. And if you're successful, you might end up getting paid tons of sweet cash by them. If you're new to the service, they offer fantasy esports contests that'll have you and your son, if you're in fact a father, rushing to sign up and play ball. Don't let this be your last rodeo. Show you're the sheriff of the fantasy esports town and play today. Now, hey, I tell you what, if they ever had drafts or fucking free agency for fantasy esports, they'd put the fucking franchise tag on me like Von Miller, mate. So, Dignitas just finished second at the Game Show Global Esports Cup Season 1 finals, and this is obviously a big-time result because Dignitas is not a team, at least with this core, that we think of as a team that should even be challenging to win these competitions. Yes, when it was the old Dignitas, that was the people who later become TSM and now Astralis, yes, they always were in contention for that, but actually at the time they themselves weren't making finals, but they obviously had the talent to. This core is supposed to be made up of the leftovers in the Danish scene. We know Astralis has pretty much all the best players, especially now that AZ has left Dignitas. So it's not like Dignitas has anyone left over who's really considered vying for that top status in Denmark. And yet, despite this, you look across 2015 and now into 2016 where they've become more of a threat, and you see this steady rise of the team, and you see these successes even with the failures, and you see them working with the limited resources they have and accomplishing much more than the sum of the parts that they have on paper. And so, yes, you look at the big results and you can see when Pimp had a really big game, or when AZ was going crazy around the last major, or you see Config come into the lineup, we know has skill. We see Rubinho, a decent Norwegian player. You can see all these players having performances. Kjærby, obviously, against Virtus Pro most recently. But the key thing to note is, behind them all, there's a consistency that's come to the team and a change in style of play that, for me, actually stems from the in-game leader, MSL. Now, to understand the concept of that we're going to talk about here, of MSL's effect, we need to look at Dignitas before MSL. So before MSL was where they actually briefly had Fetish as their in-game leader. When Fetish was kicked from the old Dignitas, which became TSM, who'd long time been the leader there, he came over and he joined up with Dignitas because Carrigan obviously got recruited as the in-game leader of Dignitas, later TSM, and they went on to much success and won 5 tournaments over the year. Now, Fetish came into Dignitas, and actually, here's the problem. We kind of saw in Dignitas that many of the problems that TSM had suffered, aside from certain individual things like, for example, devices choking, to some degree did stem from Fetish, because we saw the same stylistic failures, actually. Like we saw, they would have games where they had a big first half and then it crumbled and opponents came back. They would have a strong CT half and then they couldn't grind it out on the T side. They had failures under pressure. They would crumble when it got late in the game. All these hallmarks of the old team that later became TSM were now seen in the new Dignitas, which was the lesser team of the Pimp, AZ, these sorts of guys, Nico. And so you think of the ESL1 Katowice qualifier where they didn't make it to the major and they had these breakdowns. I think it was on Inferno against Kaboom and Vox Eminor, and it was like the same story every time of the failures of their T-sides. So you look at the team when they added MSL into the mix, and you have to understand that MSL's history is not that he's some tenured in-game leader who's always been around teams, has always been building up the style. No, what's interesting is he was more of just a support player back in Western Wolves in 2013. This was the team that had 2 second places in a row, big international competitions. There was the Mad Cats Vienna where they lost to NIP in the final, and then there was Copenhagen Games and they lost to NIP in the final again. But along the way, beat very good teams, beat very games, etc., established themselves as a top team. And then across the next months of 2013, they didn't have the same consistency. They started to have internal problems. Nico didn't want to practice. People came in and out of the lineup. Nile went in and out. But they had their good results. I mean, famously, they smashed NIP. I think it was 16-2 on Nuke at DreamHack Summer. But then themselves didn't get past the round of 8. So this was a team that had its time when it was skilled. But the thing is, the in-game leader of that team wasn't MSL. MSL was just a more supportive player. And the stars of the team was Nico, who was the main star, and Pimp was like the second star. And the rest of them were all just like working around the core of the team. But the in-game leader of the team was Glaive. And he was someone where I still think historically he's one of the better in-game leaders in the game. But something happened to this guy mentally. He was off in some fucked up way. He had some social problems going on. And so as a result, he's never gotten back to that level again. And you can see people don't really want to play with him anymore. There was even a time where the rumor was they were actually going to bring him in instead of Fetish towards the end of 2014 to go into the TS, what would later become TSM, but was the time Dignitas lineup instead of Fetish. But that move ended up falling apart. Now, MSL himself, though, what's interesting is I think being in Dignitas, I've never spoken to him about this, maybe I'll do an interview with him one day. I suspect being around Glaive and seeing this very tactical approach that Glaive had, which is very much about executing set strats and having good base setups, which take control of the map and then go into the next aspect of the rest of the play. It's having this methodical approach. It feels like it wore off on MSL because that's the style that I see him bringing to these Dignitas teams, implementing in them and now having some success in them, even though some of their lineups weren't really that skilled on paper. So he has this history in that sense, and almost immediately that he joins as the in-game leader of Dignitas, you start to see them turn things around. And then over the year, they're having this success. So as soon as he comes into the lineup, one of the early events they have is the EPL Winter. Before the ESL ESEA Pro League, we had EPL Winter, which was essentially a similar league, but ESL's European one. And at the finals there, they managed to beat Na'Vi in the group stage. Now, Na'Vi would later on beat them as in the deciding match, and Na'Vi would end up winning the tournament. But you can see, to beat Na'Vi at this point in time, when Na'Vi had Flamey, this was the second event with Flamey, was a big-time result, actually. And you looked at Na'Vi and you thought, this is a good tactical team. This has got Guardian in full effect. This has got a much more skill, and yet they managed to get this win over them. Then at DreamHack Tours in France, they managed a top 4 finish there, and they had a really close Dust 2 loss to Envious in the semi-finals and lost out to them there. Then they had a top 4 finish at Gfinity Summer Masters 1. This was when the group stage they beat Titan in 2 best of 3s, and then in the semi-finals they were so close to beating Envious. They won the first map big time. I think that was on Dust 2, and then the second map was this overtime map where they were actually up something crazy like 13-3 or something when Envious was on their CT side, and Envious did this ridiculous Deagle save on Overpass, won that round, and then turned it around and snowballed the whole game and had crazy kills, and the skill level of Envious just won the series out, and so you kind of felt for them there. But they had another top 4 finish. At the Ace of Predators Masters, here's one people forget about. So early on in the first round of the playoffs, they beat Hellraisers. They beat them 2-0. Then, I think it was 2-0, then they went up against EFrag and were upset in like a close series. And then in the lower bracket, here's the thing, they ended up finishing 4th because they faced Hellraisers again. If you remember, Hellraisers went all the way through the lower bracket, beating everyone, TSM, Dignitas, everyone, EFrag, until they got to the finals. And in the finals, they obviously beat Mouse Sports and won the whole event in a best of 7. What people forget is it could have been Dignitas in that final or even winning the event. Except when they met in the lower match, Hellraisers rematched against Dignitas. It was a really close series, and on the first map, it went overtime over to Hellraisers. Then Dignitas smashed the second map, and so Dignitas was so close to winning that series 2-0 actually, and just going through to at least top 3, if not potentially having a chance to win the tournament themselves. Then they had the troubled period. Now, the troubled period for them was around that period what I was describing before, was when Pimp and AZ were this 1-2 duo, which was giving all the firepower the team needed and was doing a really good job. And if both of them carried, they had a chance to win against these top teams. Normally, Pimp would be very consistent. AZ was a bit more up and down in the big games at the time. Then they had this period where AZ's skill level peaked. And you remember, this was around the Major and Sivo. And he was going ham in all his games. He was playing incredibly well. One of the world's best players. Admittedly, he didn't have the accomplishments to show it. But skill-wise at the time, a very effective player. The problem was, at this point in time, they'd kicked Nico and they'd put Pimp onto the AWP. Now, Pimp had always said that he was like a decent secondary AWP and he'd always shown an affinity to doing it in Copenhagen Wolves, etc. when needed. But the problem is he's not as good an AWPer as he was a rifler. At the time, his rifle level was really high. So whether they forced him onto it, whether they asked him to do it and he said he would do it, whatever the scenario is, he went over onto the AWP and he started, the first tournament or so, he was okay. Then he started to struggle. And the problem is when they were struggling was when AZ was doing really well. And so now they had this period where they finished last place at the Major, despite the fact that AZ was going crazy. They fell to Conquest at Sivo, despite the fact they looked like they had a clear route through to the semi-finals, blew that there, lost to Conquest and gave Conquest their one big good result. Then they had this period where they kick Pimp out the team. AZ leaves the team and joins what was then G2 and is now FaZe. So you think, right, well, they lost their star. They've even lost one of their older stars, but who was failing. Then they bring in Rubinho and they bring in Config. And you think, right, okay, we know Config's got some skills. There were talks about maybe he was someone on the radar of TSM. We know Rubinho's always been decent in Norway. He's been one of the more skilled players there, but hasn't really got the results to show for it. So we think, okay, I mean, I guess this is okay, but there's no way they're going to be back at the peak of where they were before. Top 4 finishes. There's no way they're really going to be contending against teams like Envy and Na'Vi. The low expectations are reasonable for this team, actually. You think they've lost the best players. What is there that's going to make it work as a team? They've lost the stars. That's the thing. Beyond that, they've had these phenomenal results. They finished top 4 DreamHack Leipzig. They beat Virtus Pro in a best of 3 there in the group stage. They finished, admittedly, with Kirby going crazy. They finished second at this Game Show League. They beat Envious 2-0. They beat CLG 2-0. Yes, they lost to Envious in the final. Envious is one of the best teams, definitely one of the most skilled teams in the entire world. So you look at this run of form and you ask, what is MSL's effect been? What are the style and strengths of his Dignitas teams be? First of all, they've got good T-sides. Now, they don't have world-class T-sides. Now, part of the reason why they don't have world-class T-sides is, like I say, they've never been a really skilled lineup in the context of the top 10 level teams in the world. They've been decent, and they've at times when they had their stars really going, they had like a good division of skill where you knew who had to play well and then what would allow them to succeed. But they don't have the luxury that teams like Fnatic, Envious, TSM, Virtus.pro have in terms of who's going to carry the game, which two players have to play well. Those teams, it's much more variable. They can get it from any angle. They can get Xyp9x to carry in the team that's now Astralis, formerly TSM. They can have Bialy go ham in a game. In Fnatic and Envious, you've got the pick of the litter. You can have anyone you want there to go crazy and you can probably win the game. In Dignitas, it was always more set as to who had to be the stars. So, good T-sides, because they have a good routine, they have a good approach, and they don't always have the firepower to execute the T-sides, but they're going to get good numbers in general out of them. One thing I really like that MSL brought to his team, actually, it may seem stubborn to a degree, but it feels like when I thought back over the history of the maps they were always winning on, the maps they always played, he's been a leader which has forced a much stricter and smaller map pool onto his team, but not in terms of we can only play these maps. In terms of identifying the 2 or 3 or 4 maps that you're going to play in the majority of series and trying to get your routine down on them. Try and figure out not only your approach, but what your small counter tweaks are going to be to the opponent. This is how you build up a good tactical approach. You don't just play every map under the sun. He's always had this smaller map pool like that, unlike other in-game leaders who not only switch things up to try and come up with new shit all the time and surprise the opponent, which can work, but it can be gimmicky. He's trying to get a good routine where there's a consistency to the results. Also, it seems to me like he's not an in-game leader who gets spooked by one bad result. We saw how that essentially ruined the now ex-TSM, now Astralis lineup, where they've been ruined on certain losses on Train, for example, where they went away from that. In other times, there's been Dust 2 that they've been scared away from, even though they're fantastic teams on these maps. Instead, it feels like MSL understands his bread and butter and he works with this palette, and that's what he's trying to succeed with. So in the Pimp and AZ lineup, when they were going really well, when things were going well earlier in the year, we're talking like spring to summer of 2015, then we're thinking of them being good on Dust 2, being good on Mirage. Even when Nico was playing really poorly, they could get something out of him on Dust 2. They could get something out of him on Mirage, have the right spots for him to hold and get something when he was really struggling individually. Then when Pimp became an AWPer and AZ started to go crazy, this was when they had to switch it up because they didn't have Pimps fragging anymore. They couldn't just play Cash or Mirage all the time and hope they'd get wins. Now they had to start being one of the teams who focused on Train, but they did, and they started to become good on Train, and they could beat teams like Virtus.pro on that map. Then when they lost those players and they came to the Config and Rubinho era, now we see they've become Cobble specialists, even though there's dangerous fucking Cobble teams out there, like Envious, like Na'Vi. You don't want to play on Cobble, they can play these guys. They can compete with all these teams on Cobble. Yeah, they're not fantastic again. They have close games with people. They've even had losses on Cobble to some of the lesser teams, but they're always there and they're always putting up a good performance overall. You've got to look at the team and say, when you consider they're not that skilled as a lineup, and never really were, but even less so now, especially in terms of the experience to go along with like raw skill being able to actually activate it in the server, you've got to say it's very impressive some of the wins they've had and some of the performances they've had. They've managed to win games during MSL's tenure against lineups that are much more skilled than them. Envious, one of the most skilled lineups of all time in both versions. Na'Vi, definitely a skilled lineup. Virtus.pro, yeah, more of a division of skill, but 3 fantastically skilled players in that team. And then for support players, a couple that on certain maps and certain positions are particularly skilled. So you're talking about beating these teams, and not only beating them on some of their strongest maps. That's how you know there's a great in-game leader at work here, or at least a very good one. Because think of some of these teams. First of all, beating Envious 2-0 at Game Show. That makes this Dignitas lineup one of only 4 teams in history to beat this Envious lineup 2-0 in a series. NiP managed it very early on at the ESL Dubai Invitational. Na'Vi have obviously done it twice. They did it at ESL Pro League Season 2, and they did it at StarLadder, and Fnatic did it with the old lineup back at the ESL 1 Cologne final of the major. That's it. No one else has beaten Envious 2-0. Like Luminosity did it 2-1, and that was in closer fashion. So that's big time when you're in that kind of company there. Then you look at the maps that they're beating these teams on, and this is impressive shit. So when they beat the old Envious on Dust 2, as I described back at Gfinity Summer Masters 1, old Envious were gods on Dust 2. They were the best team in the entire world on Dust 2. And not only did Dignitas beat them on it, but they competed with them in other tournaments on it. Then you look at the new Envious that they've just beaten 2-0. They beat that Envious on Cobblestone. Now, yes, Envious's Cobblestone has started to lack a little bit more recently, but first of all, they're still strong on it. They've become a little bit one-dimensional. You only tend to beat them if you're a good team on that map. And secondly, they had an insane streak when they put this lineup together, where they won 13 out of their first 14 on LAN on that map. So they're one of the best Cobblestone teams in the world, even still with some of their problems. You have to be very good to beat them on it. They beat Na'Vi on Cobble back in the day that EPL Winter won. Na'Vi always a strong Cobble team, especially we've seen more recently, the same lineup. And in terms of Virtus Pro, over history, they've beaten them on Train at Civo. They've beaten them on Mirage at DreamHack Leipzig. These are two of the best maps for Virtus Pro. If you ask someone who's the best team on Train, who's the best team on Mirage, many pros are going to tell you Virtus Pro. And they're beating these teams. And you notice these are different maps. Dust 2, Cobble, Train, Mirage. We've got 4 different maps there. Yes, covering a whole span of time. We're talking about like 9 months or whatever. But this is big time shit to be beating some of the best teams in the world and on their best maps. So, you think of the fact that when they beat Envious 2-0, what was the map draw? It was Cobblestone Inferno. Now, you know, with this new Envious lineup, those are their 2 strongest maps. So not only did they beat Envious 2-0, incredibly hard, a mega skilled team. With a less skilled team, they beat them on their 2 best maps. You can see that there's more going on here. It's not like it was just crazy fragging from Dignitas that's getting them all these performances, because that's not how they're doing it. Now, it is interesting that they have this rivalry with Envious, because obviously Envious, in the old lineup, and particularly this one, emphasizes mad, raw skill. And they just find base setups which allow those individual players to work their raw skill, and they try to overwhelm the opponent with aim and basic finding good aim duels. It's not they just find aim duels willy-nilly like idiots. They find the right ones, and then they win them, and that's how they break the map up, and they win their T-sides. Because we know on CT side is where they've struggled often. Now, the reason why a team like Dignitas can handle an opponent like that is, first of all, good in-game leading allows you to make basic calls when you're on CT side. So when you study their T side, which is what you've got to do against Envious, you find the tendencies of how they're going to find their matchups. You stack a man over. You have a smoke waiting for when they're going to hit that site and it delays them a second. You have a flash that puts off the guy because he can't take the aim duel, and that's what they're relying upon. They're not the team that's going to run through a smoke, have the second guy come through and know where you're going to be in trade for you. They're not that same level of tactical team. So there's ways to shortcut some of their T side. Then when you're on your T sides, you know where they want to play on their CT sides. You find out where they are. You have people flash your men in. You have people trade correctly. If you're a less skilled lineup, you want to use that principle of trading to your advantage. You want to know, right, there's a much better player than any of us perhaps waiting around this corner. So we're going to run in. So yes, the first guy might die to him, but as long as the second guy trades back, that's in our advantage as the terrorists, and we've just taken a more skilled player off the map, and now we're in a 4v4 or 3v3. These basic principles on both sides of the map, when you have a good in-game leader who studies the opponent and has a small map pool he works with, is what's going to allow you to compete with more skilled teams and sometimes upset them, as you see with these guys. Also, you got to look at the big successes that Dignitas has had over the last year. And when you look at them, you'll see it's different players all the time. So that tells me that the consistency here is the team leader and his approach and how he's getting the most out of his players. So in the summer, when they were having their top 4 finishes, that was Pimp. Yes, AZ was good, but AZ would have his difficulties in the big games. It was Pimp that was always consistent. Then in the fall, when the team had their issues and Pimp was struggling AWPing, AZ was fantastic. Then, against Virtus Pro at DreamHack Leipzig, we know it was Kirby going crazy, a guy who'd always struggled with his nerve issues, never had big games on LAN. Now he had a crazy series on LAN. Then you have Config and Rubinho had the big performance in the semi-final against CLG. Against Envious in the group stage, it was actually MSL himself who was going crazy, and Config, one of the newer guys. So one of the newer guys being brought into the LAN, being helped to be more effective, put in position to succeed. Now, what's funny about the success that MSL has had and the consistent approach to getting these good maps and rotating maps in and out of his pool is that when I look at it, I have to say that he's someone who's done a good job of identifying the strengths of his team and understanding the weaknesses and minimizing the bit. Listen, he doesn't have that skilled a lineup, so sometimes they could just get blown out of maps. They can get wrecked on Cash, they can get wrecked on Mirage, they can get wrecked on even Cobble occasionally, not usually by that much. But he's someone who's identified the skills of his team. So actually, it made me think of a big what if, which was before DreamHack I think it was before ESL won Cologne, actually. I might be off with that. Before... I actually knocked my headphones out there. Before ESL won Cologne, I think this is what I'm thinking of, was when there was this rumour that the guys from, at the time, TSM, were going to kick out Zipnix and they were going to get AZ. Because obviously we know AZ was fantastic at the time, very skilled player. And this, by the way, this wasn't really a rumour. It was going to happen, but behind the scenes, some shit went down where it couldn't happen for reasons that were beyond the ken and beyond the will of the players themselves. They wanted this move to happen. Now, if that had happened and Zipnix was kicked out, the obvious location for him would be to take AZ's spot in Dignitas. Now, what's funny is at the time, you'd think, well, that's going to be worse for Dignitas, isn't it? AZ's one of their best players. Zipnik's good, but he's playing a supportive role. Here's the funny thing. Now I wonder, and I almost wish that had happened just for the sake of Dignitas to see what MSL could have done with AZ. Because realize they eventually lost AZ anyway. He went to G2, now FaZe. Without AZ, they've actually had better results than when they had him. Not for his fault. He was a fantastic player, but just because of how they've rejigged the whole lineup now. Also, when they'd have had Zipnix, they'd have had someone who could have anchored sites. We know that's what he's been fantastic with when he was in TSM. And he's obviously still in TSM now, Astralis, but we know that's been one of his big strengths. That's why he's such a good supportive player. But also, he's one of the most skilled supportive players, and he's very good in clutch situations. So put this guy away from just supportive aspects in a lurking role. You put him on a map as a secondary entry guy or something. I could see a lot of ways you could use Zipnix and have him, well, a third guy in maybe, have him be very successful, add more to the team, add more consistency to the team, whereas AZ maybe had more crazy fragging. And actually, who knows, maybe this could have been a better team in terms of how well-rounded it would be. Less of the crazy fragging, but a better approach and a better tool to use in that sense. So it actually makes me wonder what could have been, because obviously Zipnix could have been a star player on that team. Zipnix was a star player before he joined the Dignitas lineup, back when he was in the old Fnatic, when he was known for having this crazy AK. So yeah, just an interesting what if, I think, there. So I think it's pretty obvious to me that the positive effect MSL's had on this team. And actually, as I go forwards, here's something I think about. So if the Astralis guys have their issues with Carrigan, they haven't trusted some of his picks, seems like he's having more of a contentious relationship in terms of calls. Will people follow up and go through smokes? Do people even want to play these maps that he thinks are right? He's studied and tried to anti-strat opponents, but will people execute what he wants? As long as there are these issues going on, yes, we know in the past they were thinking about kicking out Zipnix. We know in the past the talk's always been, should they kick out Cage and B? All this talk's going around. Eventually, you have to feel like one day they will do a lineup change, because it's a team that has a history of lineup changes. If they do a lineup change, here's what I wonder. If they're going to do a lineup change and Carrigan's not having as good effect, or they don't trust in his ability anymore, he's obviously still a good in-game leader. As just a fragger, he's not that great a fragger. He's good on Mirage with the AWP, we know, but otherwise he's not that great a fragger. So I wonder, one day, will they think about kicking the in-game leader? And if they kick the in-game leader, the obvious person to bring in my opinion, is MSL. He's the next guy where, if he can do this with less skilled players, maybe he could be even more fantastic with a much better team. Also, he would maybe even cure some of the ills of the Astralis team, because we know they have a deep map pool, but now they keep going and switching around because they're scared of certain maps. Well, he's a guy who makes you focus on those 2 or 3 maps, get good on them, and that's what you're going to work with. I think that would even help them. That's what they might need. Now, I don't think it would help them in terms of, I think if they could just trust in Carrigan's ability and understand that he got them all those championships in terms of setting things up so that everyone's successful, Device gets over some of his issues. Yes, Astralis can be one of the best teams in the world again, certainly. They don't need to do it, but it's just another what if, thinking down the line of where the options would come from. So I think it's a pretty undeniable effect MSL's had on the team.